There are moments in history when the language of victory conceals a far more subtle transformation. The banners still fly. The speeches are triumphant. The moral narrative appears complete. And yet, beneath the surface, something essential has already changed. Power, in its most enduring form, does not always announce itself through conquest. More often, it shifts through necessity, quietly, politely, and with impeccable justification. The events that unfolded in the early years of the Second World War offer one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon. They are usually remembered for courage, endurance, and resolve, for the steadfastness of a society under aerial assault, for the moral clarity of resistance against tyranny. All of this is deserved. But history, when approached with patience rather than reverence, reveals a second narrative, one that unfolds not on the battlefield, but in ledgers, contracts, and conversations conducted far from public view. This is not a story of betrayal, nor is it a story of generosity. It is a story of survival, and of what survival quietly demands in return. By the winter of 1940, the situation had become existential. Not militarily, resistance continued, but financially. Modern war, unlike the conflicts of earlier centuries, devoured resources at a scale no treasury could endure indefinitely. Aircraft, fuel, munitions, food, industrial inputs all required continuous replenishment, and replenishment required access. Access, in turn, required payment. For generations, the financial architecture of the world had rested upon assumptions formed during a different age. Overseas income, accumulated capital, and the invisible advantages of an established system had made endurance seem natural. That illusion did not survive the first year of total war. What had once appeared inexhaustible began to evaporate with astonishing speed. Gold reserves were depleted. Foreign currency balances vanished. Overseas assets were liquidated under conditions no prudent steward would ever choose. Yet the war could not pause. Supplies had to be secured, immediately, relentlessly, without interruption. At that moment, only one industrial economy possessed both the capacity and the distance required to meet such demand. Its factories were untouched, its workforce intact, its resources abundant, but its assistance was not unconditional. The prevailing legal framework of neutrality required that any material support be exchanged for immediate payment. No credit, no deferral, no sentiment. This arrangement on the surface appeared fair. In reality, it was devastating. It compelled a civilization accustomed to financing others to finance its own survival. In real time, at any cost. Shipments crossed oceans under threat of interception. Entire reserves were transferred in secrecy, guarded by naval escorts, as though history itself were being moved into vaults elsewhere. And still, it was not enough. By the close of 1940, the truth could no longer be deferred. The treasury was empty. Contracts remained unsigned, not for lack of will, but for lack of means. What followed has since entered popular memory as an act of enlightened assistance, an innovative arrangement designed to preserve civilization itself. The metaphor was simple, elegant, and reassuring. A neighbor's house is on fire. One does not sell a hose, one lends it. The image endured because it implied equality. It suggested temporary imbalance, mutual trust, and eventual restoration. Yet metaphors, however compelling, rarely capture structure. What was being negotiated was not merely supply, it was precedence. Before assistance could be extended, there was to be clarity, a reckoning, an accounting not only of public holdings, but of private wealth, of every asset that might yet be converted into payment. The logic was unassailable. Why should another nation underwrite a war if resources still existed elsewhere? The response to this logic would shape decades. Enterprises long regarded as foundational were identified, seized under emergency authority, and sold under conditions that reflected urgency rather than value. The buyers were aware of this urgency. The prices reflected it. What had been accumulated over generations was relinquished in months, not because it lacked worth, but because time had run out. This was not charity withheld. It was leverage exercised. And leverage, once exercised, alters relationships irreversibly. Alongside these transactions came another, quieter shift. Strategic concessions, framed as temporary practical necessities, were granted in exchange for material support, access to territory, long-term basing rights, security arrangements that would endure far beyond the war itself. Each concession made sense in isolation. Together, they reconfigured the balance of the Atlantic world. By the time formal assistance was authorized, the transformation was already underway. Supplies would flow. But independence had been exchanged for continuity, survival for solvency. And buried within the legal language of cooperation lay provisions whose significance would only become apparent after victory. They spoke not of war, but of peace, of trade, of access, of markets no longer reserved, but opened. The conflict would be fought with borrowed resources. The aftermath would be governed by new rules, rules written not in malice, but in confidence. Confidence born of abundance. This is where the true story begins. Not with defeat, not with surrender, but with the quiet recognition that endurance had come at a price whose full measure would only be felt once the guns fell silent. In the next part, we will follow this process through the remaining years of war and into the moment when victory finally arrived, only to reveal that the reckoning had merely been postponed. As the war progressed, the transformation that had begun in quiet desperation hardened into structure. What was initially framed as an emergency arrangement evolved into a system. And systems, once formed, begin to shape outcomes independently of intention. Material assistance increased in scale and scope. Ships crossed oceans in endless convoys. Factories worked without pause. Supplies arrived not as isolated shipments, but as lifelines woven into the very functioning of the war economy. Dependence, once temporary, became habitual. This was not perceived as weakness. On the contrary, it was celebrated as coordination, a triumph of modern alliance, proof that industrial civilization could mobilize itself against existential threat. And yet coordination conceals hierarchy. Those who control supply chains shape tempo. Those who determine access define priority. Those who finance continuity acquire influence. None of this required overt assertion. The structure spoke for itself. As domestic production was increasingly oriented toward immediate survival, long-term investment quietly withered. Enterprises that had once generated overseas income were gone. Capital that might have financed reconstruction after the war had been consumed in the present. The war was being won, but the future was being mortgaged. Within this context, attention began to shift beyond the battlefield. The question was no longer merely how to prevail, But what kind of world would emerge once victory was secured? Here, the divergence of interests became unmistakable. One side sought restoration, a return, insofar as possible, to pre-war equilibrium, stability through continuity, recovery through managed adjustment. The other sought redesign, not out of hostility, but conviction. The interwar period had demonstrated in brutal fashion the consequences of instability: competitive devaluations, trade barriers, financial collapse, political extremism. A different architecture was required. An architecture, by necessity, reflects the position of its builders. By the middle years of the conflict, planning for a new financial order was already advanced. Committees met, proposals circulated, models were debated with intellectual rigor. The language was technical, abstract, and deliberately depoliticized. Yet beneath that language lay a simple reality. Those who possessed reserves would define rules. Those who required access would accept them. This was not imposed. It was internalized. Participation promised stability. Non-participation promised isolation. In such circumstances, choice becomes symbolic. The great conference convened while the war was still ongoing is often remembered as a moment of collective aspiration. And in many respects, it was. Delegates spoke of cooperation, predictability, and shared prosperity. Institutions were proposed to mitigate crises and coordinate response. But the balance within the room was unmistakable. One delegation arrived with abundance of capital, of gold, of confidence. Its proposals assumed centrality. Another arrived with experience, sophistication, and historical memory, but without leverage. Elegance of design does not compensate for absence of reserves. Ideas, however refined, require sponsorship. The resulting system reflected this imbalance. A single currency assumed the role once occupied by another. Exchange rates were stabilized around it. Global liquidity flowed through its instruments. The arrangement was not exploitative. It was effective. And effectiveness, in the aftermath of devastation, is persuasive. The war ended eventually, as all wars do. Not with closure, but with exhaustion. Celebration followed. Relief. A collective exhalation. Yet beneath the surface, the financial reality was stark. Assistance that had sustained survival was withdrawn with administrative finality. The justification was procedural, not punitive. The emergency had passed. The program had fulfilled its mandate. What remained was a structure in which former assumptions no longer applied. Immediate crises emerged. Supply chains faltered. Currency pressures intensified. Reserves drained with alarming speed. A loan was negotiated. Its terms were rational. Its implications profound. Convertibility was demanded in the name of openness. Preferences were dismantled in the name of fairness. Markets were opened in the name of efficiency. Each condition, taken alone, was defensible. Together, they marked the end of a model. The consequences were not instantaneous, but they were decisive. A currency that had once anchored global trade now struggled to defend its value. An empire that had once financed the world now struggled to finance itself. Political change followed economic reality, not as collapse, as retreat. Administrative responsibilities became untenable. Commitments were relinquished not because they lacked meaning, but because they lacked funding. This is how power recedes in the modern world, not through defeat, but through balance sheets. And yet, it would be a mistake to interpret this as tragedy alone. What emerged in its place was a period of unprecedented growth and stability. Trade expanded, living standards rose. Conflict between major powers was, for a time, contained. The system worked, but it worked by concentrating authority. And concentration, however benign its origins, invites future tension. The transfer of financial leadership that occurred during this period did not announce itself as such. It was understood only later, in retrospect, when restoration proved impossible. By then, the world had adapted. In the next part, we will confront the question that lingers beneath this entire narrative. Was this outcome a failure of judgment, or the inevitable result of structural forces no one could have resisted? To answer that, we must examine not morality, but incentives. And incentives, once revealed, rarely flatter anyone involved. To ask whether events might have unfolded differently is to confront the limits of agency itself. History is often narrated as the consequence of choice. Leaders decide, governments act, treaties are signed. Yet beneath this theater lies a more durable force: constraint. War is the most absolute form of constraint ever devised. It compresses time, erases margin for error, and reduces even the most complex civilizations to a single imperative: continuity. Within such conditions, freedom of action becomes illusionary. One side faced annihilation if supply faltered. The other faced uncertainty if it failed to shape the aftermath. Both acted rationally. And rationality, when asymmetrical, produces hierarchy. The assumption that generosity could have been unconditional misunderstands the nature of power exercised through systems. Assistance at scale is never neutral. It creates dependence not because of intention, but because of arithmetic. When one economy provides the majority of another's essential inputs, food, fuel, industrial capacity, it becomes embedded in the recipient's survival. From that moment onward, the relationship is no longer reciprocal. It is structural. Those who imagine that such a relationship could have remained temporary overlook the permanence of logistics. Factories retool, supply chains reorient, institutions adapt. Once embedded, reversal becomes costly. And cost, in a fragile post-war world, is prohibitive. Domestic considerations further constrained outcomes. Public memory of unpaid obligations from the previous war had not faded. Political legitimacy depended on demonstrating that assistance was neither indulgent nor indulgently imperial. Aid had to be justified as investment in stability, not preservation of hierarchy. This required visible transformation. Structures associated with exclusivity had to be dismantled. Preferential arrangements had to yield to openness. Markets had to appear neutral, even if neutrality favored those already positioned to compete. Such measures were not conceived as punitive. They were conceived as preventative against a return to fragmentation, preventative against instability, preventative against another cycle of collapse. And yet prevention is rarely neutral. It privileges those prepared to act within its constraints. The post-war financial architecture emerged not as a compromise between equals, but as an equilibrium dictated by reserves. Those who held liquidity set terms. This is neither moral nor immoral. It is mechanical. The sophistication of alternative proposals, however compelling intellectually, could not overcome this reality. Ideas require capital to become institutions. Capital had migrated. The outcome was therefore inevitable, not because of malice, but because of distribution. The deeper lesson lies not in the transfer itself, but in how seamlessly it occurred. There was no formal abdication. No declaration of succession, no moment of reckoning. Power simply reoriented. Participation in the new order became synonymous with recovery. Resistance became synonymous with delay. Within such framing, choice is performative. Acceptance is survival. What followed confirmed the logic. Reconstruction proceeded at unprecedented scale. Industrial capacity expanded. Consumption increased. Standards of living rose. From a human perspective, the system delivered. From a structural perspective, it concentrated authority. And concentration, over time, generates the very conditions that provoke its own questioning. The seeds of future tension were sown not in failure, but in success. Dependence stabilized the present. It complicated the future. As decades passed, the system's neutrality became assumed. Its infrastructure became invisible. Its authority became normalized. Normalization is the final stage of dominance. Once a system is no longer perceived as contingent, it begins to tempt assertion. What began as stewardship slowly acquired elements of enforcement. Rules hardened. Access became conditional. Compliance replaced consensus. The logic remained consistent with its origins. Stability must be preserved. Order must be maintained. Yet each assertion subtly altered perception. Systems once regarded as universal frameworks began to appear as instruments, and instruments invite alternatives. The transformation examined here is therefore not confined to the mid-20th century. It established a template, a demonstration that financial leadership could shift without conquest, that institutions could outlast empires, that continuity could be preserved at the cost of exclusivity. This template has been observed, studied, and internalized. Those who came later learned its lessons well. They learned that dependence is vulnerability, that neutrality is conditional, that redundancy is resilience. Once these lessons are absorbed, behavior changes irreversibly. This is why the most consequential historical shifts are rarely dramatic. They are procedural. They unfold in committee rooms, in reserve allocations, in settlement mechanisms. By the time their significance is recognized, they have already become embedded. In the final part, we will step back from chronology and mechanics and consider the deeper implication. What this episode reveals about power itself, and why even the most successful systems must eventually confront the limits of their own design. Civilizations rarely perceive the moment when stewardship begins to replace command. The transition is too quiet for ceremony, too procedural for drama, too reasonable to resist. Power does not vanish, it recalibrates. What distinguishes a dominant financial order is not its capacity to compel, but the assumption that participation is inevitable, that systems are neutral, access assured, continuity guaranteed. When that assumption fades, authority endures, but dominance does not. The episode examined here is often remembered through the lens of moral clarity and collective endurance. These elements deserve their place. Yet history, when approached without reverence, reveals a deeper truth. The most decisive outcomes are not always intended. They are produced by structure. The arrangements forged under the pressure of total war were not designed to humiliate or diminish. They were designed to function, to stabilize a world exhausted by catastrophe. And they succeeded. Reconstruction advanced with unprecedented speed. Trade expanded across borders once closed. Prosperity, uneven but tangible, followed. The system worked because it concentrated trust. But trust, once concentrated, becomes tempting to administer. Administration becomes governance. Governance becomes enforcement. Enforcement, however subtle, reshapes perception. This is the quiet arc of financial power. What began as coordination gradually acquired expectation. What was once facilitation slowly became conditionality. The change was incremental, almost imperceptible. Normalization completed what necessity had begun. This is not a story of error. It is a story of limits. No system designed for universality can indefinitely serve as an instrument of discretion without consequence. Neutrality, once compromised, cannot be restored by reassurance alone, only by time. And time, as history repeatedly demonstrates, does not preserve exclusivity. The most revealing aspect of this transformation lies not in its impact on any single nation, but in the lesson it imparted globally. Dependence carries cost. Redundancy offers insurance. Optionality confers autonomy. Once these principles are internalized, behavior adjusts, quietly, persistently, irreversibly. The world does not reject existing systems. It prepares to live without them. This preparation is not ideological. It is managerial. It takes place in reserve allocations, in settlement practices, in infrastructural design. It is executed by institutions whose mandate is continuity, not confrontation. And continuity, once decoupled from singular authority, becomes plural. Plurality is not disorder. It is resilience. From this perspective, the events of the mid-20th century are neither cautionary tale nor celebration. They are instruction. They demonstrate how power transfers without collapse, how leadership evolves without declaration, how dominance fades without defeat. They also remind us that the most enduring influence is exercised through restraint. Systems that survive do so because they are trusted. Trust endures only when neutrality is preserved. Once systems are perceived as instruments, belief thins, and belief, once thinned, redistributes. The great irony is that success itself accelerates this process. The more effective a system becomes, the more consequential its assertions appear. The more central it grows, the more vulnerable it becomes to scrutiny. This is not failure. It is the natural life cycle of authority exercised through infrastructure. History does not judge this process. It records it. If you have followed this reflection to its conclusion, you have engaged with history not as spectacle, but as pattern. You have allowed complexity to remain intact. You have resisted simplification. You have considered power without indignation. Such engagement is rare and necessary. If this analysis offered perspective rather than provocation, its value lies not in agreement, but in contemplation. A measured response, thoughtfully expressed, affirms that depth still matters. And if there is one person whose judgment you respect, someone with whom disagreement sharpens understanding rather than diminishes it, sharing this reflection may lead to a conversation worth having. That is how serious ideas endure, not through insistence, but through minds willing to consider them.